Station 51, engine 27, engine 32, truck 105.
You're listening to The Fire Break with Steve Wolf. Welcome back to The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, The Fire Break is sponsored by, take a guess, Team Wildfire. You already knew it. We're trying to figure out how to put out big fires with smaller jet engines. Actually, some big jet engines too, but I guess jet engine size is all relative. Anyway, I'm going to be speaking today with Teal Brown Zimring. And Teal is the executive director of Lab to Land and a managing partner at Galvanize Partners. And you know how sometimes you could say it's not me, it's not you, it's just not the right time. Well, Teal and I had an experience like that because both of our internets weren't working a few weeks ago. We tried, we got into good questions and answers and all that, but the internet wasn't happening and it wasn't going to work out for us at that time. But we're hoping now the internet's better and we could actually do the interview that we had always wanted to do. But we're going to do it today. And today's a better day because it's the only day there is. So Teal, welcome to The Fire Break. How are you?
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm so happy to be here. And I'm doing great. I'm
You
excited
bet.
for the conversation.
Awesome. So Teal, the general ideas around wildfire are all, in my experience, pretty tired at this point, right? We all know don't plant stuff 5 feet from your house, blah blah blah, and really a lot of that stuff is consumer facing. So I think what's most interesting is to look at wildfire from the unique perspectives of people who play in this space, from their own silo. And of course, eventually, we've got to bring all these silos together so we have some actionable data. But tell me about your silo. What are you working on and how do you look at the wildfire issue?
Mm. Well, it's so interesting. I started working on and thinking about wildfire about 7 years ago, which may not sound like long ago, and came from a background in political economics, not as a scientist or researcher. And I do think that the conversation has evolved so much in those 7 years that you can now begin to speak in more of your silo or expertise. So it's interesting to hear you reflect that. I've seen that change, I think. The place where I am working these days, as it relates to wildfire, is that I have spent quite a bit of time thinking about how we can create economic value from high hazard fuels that are the byproduct or that need to be removed as a part of ecological thinning, and generally don't have value economically that merits removal or usage for other products in other markets in a way that actually creates demand to increase the pace and scale of ecological thinning. And through that work have done a bunch of different things for the state of California, ranging from chairing a equity and development committee for the Joint Institute for Wood Product Innovation on how we think about biomass market growth and the state's investment in the use of these materials, to thinking about and evaluating different end products like hydrogen or heat, electricity, which are also outputs from these materials. And then more recently, I've been thinking specifically about advanced biological sciences, or what we call biotechnology, which is the use of studying biology itself and ecology to think about how we might assist with the resilience of our forest ecosystems, or how we might replace some current harmful practices that we have that create problems in the way that we manage wildfire with biological or natively occurring alternatives. I can tell you more about that. But in many ways, I've taken the turn toward what are the technologies that drive thinning or might improve upon what we do today in terms of how we manage landscapes.
For me, the main technologies that drive thinning would be like walking and proper diet. And I find that creates a thinning effect.
Yeah, it's effective.
And I'm still working on it. So let me make sure I understand what you're talking about from the top there. Essentially, we've allowed forests to overgrow because we put out too many fires. And now there's this huge fuel load on the ground that in specific locations where they threaten communities, we would like to thin that so that when they do burn, it's not the massive conflagrations that take out whole cities. So we go in there and we cut the trees down, essentially. The thing being that some of those trees are really big and awesome for making lumber out of, and some of them are tiny and scrappy and have no board foot value in the lumber community. The branches that get trimmed off and the leaves and all this other stuff that is just as flammable from a utility perspective if you wanted to burn it or make paper towels or toilet paper out of it. But it's not, immediately commercial the way you think about lumber.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just want to make sure I'm following right. What uses do we have for this other, what you call biomass, and I would just call tree trimmings, so that so that we're not investing huge amounts of transportation dollars to move them somewhere to do something with them, but basically harvest them and use them in the place where we capture them.
Mm-hmm.
Is that?
And there's been a huge
Am I understanding
amount.
that right? And so you're wondering, can we make heat or hydrogen or cellulose for clothing or whatever else we might do with it?
All of these things. There's been yes. Yes, and is the short answer. There's been a huge amount of investment over the last several years in thinking about how we might use these small diameter, branches, pine needles, exactly to your point, tree trimmings, to create products that are regionally valuable for the communities that are close to where these tree trimmings are. And when they are removed, dramatically not only decrease fire risk, but also speed the pace at which forest landscapes can then receive cultural burning or beneficial fire, which is really the management regime we want to get to. So removing these, what I called high hazard fuels, which is just a state designation, but removing this overcrowding material, which is not natural and which is the result of the way we've managed the land for some time now, is a first step before we can then manage through beneficial fire or cultural fire, prescribed burns.
So what we do with the biomass and how we go about prescribed burns, etc. This is really more in the realm of science and less in the realm of politics and economics, which was your background. So are you transitioning to more of the practical side, or are you figuring out how we can use economics to create more of a market for these byproducts?
I appreciate that question and very much the latter. I think that a lot of times when we're looking at
Ladder fuels you're talking about?
Oh, no, ladder as in the ladder example, economics and thinking about how we use markets. So yeah, I think that it's very interesting and compelling to get to show up as a political economist, as someone who thinks about markets and regional demonstration scale projects and circular economics, rather than as someone who's looking, at the earliest stages of the technology and the science research, but instead, where are the opportunities, the proof points, the interesting ways to use dollars that can move some of the goals that the scientists are telling us are really critical. Laddering into impact. I'll use your laddering.
Oh, I like that. So in order for these new goals to be achieved or to have any measure of success with them, there has to be an economic incentive. It has to make sense if you're going to do it through private markets. If you're going to use public funds, who cares, right? That's just the taxpayer. Oh, wait a minute. I'm one of them. but what you're trying to do is look at, like, are there investments that we could make that would serve physically practical, valuable change, and then make money on that?
hmm I think you bring
And
up a
what's holding
very,
prom? I'm voting for I'm voting for paper towels myself.
paper towels. I mean, I suppose you're never going to see a lack of demand for them as much as we might try for that to be the case. So maybe that's the outcome we should be looking for.
But should we be? I guess what I was going is, should we be trying for that? Because for some of this biomass, that's the highest best use of pulp product. That doesn't have a board lumber application. So I worry that when they say, use a rag, save a tree, the presumption behind that is just there's not enough trees. But in
hmm
some areas, there's too many trees, and maybe there's too many trees because we have cut the demand too sharply, with the result being surplus fuels on the ground.
Well, and I think that embedded in that conversation is something you brought up, which is if we are aiming for private markets to be the driver of the thinning that we think needs to be done. And I think, that's kind of a logical fallacy, right? The public impact of decreasing the risk of wildfire vastly exceeds what a private market can or should be paying for right now. And I think to imagine that a product or a set of products or some, regional circular set of waste to value products is going to be the reason that we get to move at a faster pace to drive what we're calling ecological thinning is, I think, at first problematic. And so it's important to name that the public sector and the public benefit, however it is that we get to the dollars, and there's interesting conversations there about how to use that money in creative and interesting ways, that it shouldn't be the main driver, and that we need to look to, for example, paper towels, to be a demand source. Isn't the reduction in risk logical enough as a source of demand to drive thinning at greater scale? So I think there's that conversation which
I
underlies
see.
the question of what's the product portfolio, if that makes sense.
Okay, so Teal, it sounds like what you're saying is that creating more of a demand for pulp through something that would be economically profitable is in fact pulp fiction.
um, I'm going to say yes, even though, of course, there's a million caveats I would add to that, but it's so good that yes, pulp fiction.
It's so good that yes. There's no truth behind it, but it was worth it for the joke, huh?
But it was worth it for
Or
the
there
joke.
is truth behind it.
There, I
Okay, good.
think, is a as with all things, no one answer will be the truth, or will be complete. And I do think, when you get deep into this space, and for anyone who's spent a lot of time thinking about how we drive the usage of what, are fundamentally in some ways, even though this is kind of hard to hear, but sort of waste materials that oftentimes don't go to their highest and best use, to your point. There is a conversation a lot of times around, well, how do we get to the best possible economic value? And that's going to be the solution. And so I do think it's really important to measure ourselves and caveat ourselves around, look, there's a public impact, and a huge portion of this can, will, and should be paid for the fact of the public impact. And it's, of course, not totally pulp fiction to think that there are products or portfolios of products or economic models that can bring private markets to bear in a way that, the way I would think of it is, we're not looking for scale at like a national scale. Everybody in the Midwest buying California forest paper towels, but regional demonstration scale projects that can sort of show the art of the possible. What is it that we can create that is of value within a region, that lowers the emissions costs, that uses some public capital, brings private capital to bear, and through that de-risks policy, which allows us to show up with more dollars from the public sector. And that whole portfolio is what allows us to move at a swifter pace and scale, if the piece of the de-risking that we're talking about is specific to the ecological thinning.
So maybe we need the government funding to come in and de-risk it, at which point then it becomes commercially viable.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, there was is the California State Climate Catalyst Fund and some other funding mechanisms that very explicitly have that goal. Some of them I think have been not quite as effective as we hoped they might be, but very specifically intended toward, what are the ways that we can use dollars to do exactly what you just said, de-risk, such that we can look to different types of capital to show up.
And what's your opinion? Where would you like to see? You just based, and I know no matter what you do, it always needs more research to have a definitive answer.
Yeah.
But we have discussed the role of intuition in this. And so you don't have to have a concrete answer to know what your intuition is. And so where do you feel like the best, where do you feel like the most fertile area for research, for investment, for regulation? Like, what's your gut telling you?
Yeah. Okay. I do have a gut, of course. I think that
I knew it.
One of the challenges that we confront in thinking about moving more dollars and more political intention in the direction of mitigating wildfire before it starts and building resilience in our landscapes before they start. So let me put a finer point on that. Most of the federal and state budgets that could broadly be described as focused on wildfire are focused on fighting fire. Increasingly, we see more money focused on, communities hardening and home hardening and these types of things, but less money generally on how do we build resilience in the landscape such that it's at lower risk. So I say that to say, how do we get there? How do we shift that balance in the direction of more money focused on lowering the risk, doing what is healthy, healing, and resilient for the land before the fire starts? I think one of the best ways to get there is to do things at a scale where communities are at the table, recognizing that they see the problem the same way that the scientists, the economists, the regulators, the investors see the problem. And when we define the problem the same way, we tend to be open to more pathways to the solution. And so this is hard, community-oriented, multi-stakeholder, demonstration scale work. And my gut is that the really interesting space for investment, whatever types of dollars we're talking about, is demonstration scale regional work that drives resilience in a region and allows us to see, touch, feel, have our homes heated by, have our backup power be, have our poles and structural products become from these materials that we're talking about. And because we can then see it, feel it, touch it, understand it, have gone through it, I think that is the most effective pathway to telling the stories and showing what's possible in such a way that we could shift federal and state budgets in the direction of resilience, not just fighting the fire. Shift private investment in that direction as well.
So because of American culture being what it is, response, preparedness, right? Like there's no money for mitigation in advance. endless money once the fire starts, right? We don't do proactive very well in this country. And now with federal governments slashing the budgets for the actual wildland firefighters themselves, who are quitting in droves, if we don't have the money to, to even pay for the firefighters, what's the chance that the government's going to get behind, long-term mitigation efforts, where you don't see a result within the 4 years of an election cycle?
Well, there's a lot in that question, ranging from the cycling of funding to what might we do about the firefighters. I'm not super expert in this space, but I know that there are some interesting, and you may know more about this, Steve. I'm guessing you do. Interesting proposals around how wildfire fighters could become full-time year-round jobs with additional skill sets or requirements or opportunities during the non-firefighting seasons, whether that's around things we're talking about here, like how do we use and move and engage with these materials we want to use for thinning or beneficial fire, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a space that's interesting. And I don't know much, but I'd be curious to learn. Of course, we're seeing folks quitting in droves. How much of that is about lack of stable employment, lack of stable housing, lack of, long-term, health insurance and reliability of their job? And could we actually provide full-time year-round, compelling jobs that also include the prevention space? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think
a lot of it is
stuff out there.
Yeah, and I suspect a lot of it is the loss of our ability to control the narrative. That if you're, 18, 20-year-old kid and, you saw these really glamorous movies about smoke jumpers and you read some neat books about it when you're growing up, it looks like a really glamorous, fun thing to do. And people went into it. But now with more social media, there's no more, hiding the reality of the fact. You're sleeping on cold ground, you're sleeping out in the rain, you're working 12, 18 hours a day, you don't get days off, you're wearing the same stinky clothes for months. It's just, and you're getting paid the crap. I know firefighters that want to do wildland firefighting, but they have to have a day job in order to support that because it doesn't pay enough. So now people know the reality, and there's a rumor that kids are softer now, that that people really are not willing to undergo physical hardships the way people either used to enjoy or tolerated, or there was some kind of a badge about it. So I like your idea, right? Full-time, year-round fire something, right? When there's fires, you're a firefighter. When you're not fighting a fire, you're doing fire prevention and mitigation, and then you actually have a job, an annual salary, and that I think would be more appealing to people. Benefits, like all that stuff, right? But I think because of the physical stresses of that job, it's really, it's a job for younger people. And they might not care so much about, their 401k or something. Like those are things for old them that's not even part of their imagination yet. So figuring out what exactly is going to motivate people at that age is really important.
It's such an interesting question. And when, in California, we have the High Road Jobs Training Program. And one of the things that is highlighted in some of the economic analysis that led to that policy is that we put the training programs in one location and then the jobs are in another location. So if you've got folks that are building families, they're doing their education or their training for however long in one place, but then the job requires them to move. It's no longer that easy if they've started to build their families in one place. And so why is the training not in the same location that many of the jobs might ultimately be? And these are some of the questions that I know came up in there. And then there's another thing that comes to my mind, and I'm curious your take on this, which is perhaps not a huge driver of the change we're seeing, but I think there's a cultural shift that may be happening and probably needs to happen, which is the image we have of the firefighter standing on the crest and conquering the flames as the way that we interact with fire. And when we talk about a shift toward prevention funding, toward resilience activity, toward policies that prioritize that space, we're not talking about conquering flames. We're talking about living with fire, breathing more smoke, being in relationship with the land in a very different way. And I do wonder if that childhood dream of, the firefighter standing on the hillside with the flames at his, because it's a he, back, is also something that sort of has to shift when we talk about living with fire and prioritizing resilience, rather than just, sort of fighting catastrophic fire.
And when we think about people living in the WUI, we talk about, homes that are built, in the forest, essentially, in some cases, in the extreme cases, right? And so one might advocate that when a wildfire comes through there, the fire will solve the problem that you're living in the forest, because the forest won't be there anymore. If you can save the home and lose the forest, well, then you've got a nice home in pasture land instead of forest land, which might not be what you signed up for, but ultimately would be much safer. Mm-hmm. So because of people's resistance to prescribed burn, now there's this idea, well, we weren't going to do a prescribed burn, but since there's already a fire going there, why don't we just let the fire do its thing, let it thin the tree load, and we'll just focus on a defensive strategy, defend these homes, defend this neighborhood, and let the rest of it go, because it'll come back, but it'll come back in a more natural, healthy, less overgrown way.
Yeah, and another thing you're pointing to is the I can't think in the moment of the right language for it, but yeah, the use of an active burn as a way to just say, well, we can get a few more acres of, low intensity heat on the land right now. We don't have to wait for the burn window, the red card, whatever it is that has a policy, infrastructural, economic barrier to get there. We got some flames on the land. Let's add a few more over here where we know we need it.
Yeah.
And creativity around how we get, to the prevention and resilience space, leveraging the fire to get there. And actually, when you made your comment, I thought you were going to go in a different direction and talk about sort of the protect at all cost mentality. And I don't know if you're familiar with the case in California where some Forest Service employees sued the U.S. Forest Service for failure to protect the ecological resilience of the landscape by prioritizing protecting WUI and humans at all costs, or putting the fire out.
Oh, they sure don't understand how the insurance business works, do they?
That's right. That's right. Are you familiar with that case?
I'm not, but that's fascinating.
Isn't it interesting? And what happened was the judge said, look, I will always prioritize the protection of humans' life and built infrastructure. That's my job. That's what we have to do. He, the judge, and then also, that's where the policies lie. That's what we're supposed to do. And there was a comment in the decision that said, maybe though, over time, we should find a way for the EPA or another appropriate authority to be looking over the shoulder and watching for those metrics of forest management that are not just about the preservation of, the WUI or the people, but are also about the ecological resilience and the ecosystem services and the biodiversity that we rely on. And we're not there, but it was really interesting to see a judge say, maybe one day,
Yeah, lawyers representing the planet,
Right?
right? Yeah. What's good for the, yeah, yes. And the idea that what's good for the planet is divergent from what's good for people is in itself ridiculous. Like, where, if we destroy, the planet, well, what's our backup plan for where we're going to live?
Right. Right. We are as a species not particularly good at paying for avoided futures. It's not one of our skill sets.
Right. What are you thinking about future-wise?
Well, it's funny, we've been talking
Yeah.
about, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Um, we've been talking about prevention and resilience, and yet a lot of my work right now is focused on firefighting. So,
He's focused on firefighting.
yeah, yeah. So, coming from a slightly different angle, back to sort of, ecological resilience, but one of the things we're working on right now is thinking about where there's opportunity for really new and burgeoning science to deliver deeper understanding that would help us improve a whole variety of things, ranging from, and I could give you specific examples, but ranging from, deep characterization of the microbial makeup of our forest soils after fire at different heat intensities. It may well be that beneficial fire return intervals, which is the language we use for how swiftly we should bring back low intensity fire to manage a landscape, are going to change and are changing, rather swiftly in climate change and with other pressures and conditions. So that's an area that we're thinking about around, what would it look like to have a soil fire reference library that showed us the genomic makeup of the microbiome and of what has to live near what for it to have the most water in the soil, what rocks being nearby or other geophysical characterizations help us understand what ecosystem services are at greatest risk and which aren't. So that's an area of interest. And then in the firefighting space, when we drop minerals on flames, which is how we fight fire, because minerals tend not to burn, so they're very effective at not burning. And yet, even though phosphorus and nitrogen are naturally occurring nutrients in ecosystems, when you drop that much phosphorus on a landscape, it matters over time. So we're seeing this nutrient loading, from extreme phosphorus levels, and it's having genetic impacts on what regrows and what doesn't. Some of the species that regrow happen to be actually drier and therefore more flammable. And they are phosphorus-loving species that will, increasingly regrow, and we'll see, exacerbation of either novel competition or novel species or all sorts of things that we don't know because of the phosphorus nutrient loading. We see algal blooms in our water streams, all this kind of stuff. So one of the things I'm interested in is how we might mitigate the nutrient loading from the way that we fight fire. So that's kind of, I guess, where that ecological resilience vantage point does meet the firefighting lately.
Yeah, it's always one of my favorite topics is the unintended consequences, right?
Right.
So the chemicals that we're dropping on fires are causing new forests to regrow that are more flammable than the old ones. Almost as if the exposure to the fire retardant, right,
Yes.
is yeah.
Yes. It's just
Gotta
remarkable.
love it, right?
And in fire, we see it
Yeah.
in a few different, I don't know if you're familiar with the VPD effect, but I'm sure you are, but it's this idea that climate change is kind of like a giant atmospheric mosquito sucking water and hydration out of the trees. And that creates a more flammable forest, that burns exacerbates climate change, and we see that cycle speed up over time. And that's called the VPD effect, or grow over time. So we see all of these negative feedback loops that are taking place that are so, I think, magnified in the wildfire space. And it's part of what makes it a really fascinating place to work in technology or in economics, because when the sky turns orange in San Francisco, you just get a different license to consider different solutions. And so these are horrible side effects, but like it does give you more space to be creative, I guess.
Yes, and that effect is magnified when the sky turns orange in New York City.
Yes.
Now it's really a problem, right?
Right. Like you must have.
Right, because it's so different than expectations.
Right. Get those phone calls last summer, people going, wait a second. But this is what was happening out west. Now that I'm breathing the smoke.
Right. Well, yeah, now that you're breathing the smoke, it's a problem, right? Yeah. But, Wall Street's in New York. Wall Street drives the economics of much of this. And so when they get a taste of the smoke, that's probably a very healthy thing for investment in better climate tech and in fire mitigation.
I have to agree with you on that. I do think the more we see, feel, touch, hear, understand the way that these very, very real and felt climate change concerns and catastrophes like wildfire, which is not just climate change, it's important to note, but the more we show up for new and different solutions with new and different types of money, for sure.
And one thing that we should never underestimate next to human stupidity is human ingenuity. That humans have a very averaging effect, right? There's the worst end, but then there's really geniuses out there that come up with amazing things that continue to surprise us and often are able to, at least temporarily, turn bad situations around. So
I like that as the averaging effect. At least at some, we'll come to some moderate middle. How do we push ourselves toward one end?
Yes, indeed. Well, Teal, it was fascinating chatting with you today. Really excited to see what directions you take your mission in and the effects that they have. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Steve. What a pleasure. I appreciate it.
You bet. And we're going to follow up on this. I'm going to check back with you monthly and see what's going on. All right, folks, this is Teal Brown Zimring. She's the executive director of Lab to Land, the managing partner of Galvanize Partners. And Teal, if folks want to reach out to you or follow what you're up to, what's the best way to reach you?
Teal, T-E-A-L, at labtolandinstitute.org. You can check out our website too.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'll put a link right here, or right here, or right here, whichever way the picture sits next to the text. That's it. Teal Brown Zimring, thanks so much. Folks, you've been listening to and hopefully watching and enjoying The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire. Until the next one, take care and be safe.